So basically, everybody has some kind of addiction, whether it's alcohol, sugar, social media, weed, any number of things.
Right.
And even if it's not bad enough to require you to go to rehab, it is going to be bad enough to slow you down such that you're stuck in a pattern of mediocrity. Assuming that you agree with that.
I do agree with that. That's it. It's the first time I've ever heard somebody say that everyone has some form of addiction, but I agree with you. Probably not for the reason you think, but I do agree with you.
All right. Give people your most compelling argument as to why those things are probably worse than they think.
Well, because, we used to say in the mortality space, and I was a mortality researcher for 22 years, that the absence of dopamine is the presence of addiction. And if you look, for example, at sugar addiction, most people are not liking the taste of sugar. Yes, we like the sweet taste of sugar. The truth is most of us don't like sugar. We're addicted to sugar. And why is that? Because when we eat sweets, we actually get a dopamine reward, right? We get an actual little endorphin reward. If you look at the most addiction, the history of most addiction, if you've ever been an addict or you've known a true addict, addiction has a tendency to shift and not really ever go away. Alcoholics become drug addicts become workoutaholics become workaholics become gamblers. So why does addiction have a tendency to shift? Because you can cure the physical addiction, but the dopamine deficiency drives the behavior. Like serotonin is one of the main drivers of mood, dopamine is one of the main drivers of behavior. That's why I often say, you show me a child that can play video games for 14 hours a day, I'll show you a future addict. Right? They're generally not playing the video game because they like the video game. They're playing the video game because it makes them feel normal. In fact, most addiction does not begin with the search for getting banged up. Most addicts didn't wake up one day and go, I want to get really banged up. They woke up one day and said, I want to feel normal. And it was the search for normalcy that led to an addiction. And then once they had a physical addiction, now they're running from a low. They're not running towards a high. If you talk to a true alcoholic, a true drug addict, very often that habit is continuing because they do not want to go off that cavernous hole that's right behind them. And it's not that they are any longer chasing that high. So I do agree with you. A lot of people have a dopamine deficiency, which drives different types of addictive behavior. And we have addictive behaviors that we would consider healthy addictions, right? I mean, when I was a triathlete, I was never a professional triathlete, but I was a very competitive amateur triathlete. I would say that 35 or 40% of the guys that I raced with were recovering addicts of one form or another. So this was their new addiction. Centuries, 100-mile bike rides, 2.5-mile swims, 13-mile runs. This was their new addiction, and they were psycho committed to it.
I know there's people that are going to listen to this and they will not like the fact that I use the word addiction. Mm-hmm. The reason that I use that is I think that there are things that we do habitually. Mm-hmm. So from the classic definition of an addict, of somebody who will do something even in the face of it absolutely destroying their lives, right. I think that for the people that watch this show, there's probably a higher likelihood that they have a different avenue of thing that is softening the quality of their life. And those are the things that I want to call out and see map sort of your thinking around this. So when I think about alcohol use, there's a lot of people that they can do it without it being addictive. Like, I don't have an addictive personality, right? But when I go in on something, I go way in on that thing. And so I know people will go through a party phase. So when people come to me and say, hey, I want to be an entrepreneur, I'm like, amazing. If you really want that, though, you're going to have to sell your 20s. Mm-hmm. So most people are going to sell their 20s to partying. Mm-hmm. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you're going to have to, quote unquote, sell your 20s to that. So you're going to have to be in skill acquisition going hard. Okay. And so if you've got somebody that comes home every day and they're smoking weed, they're going out, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, drinking, I have no moral problem with that whatsoever. But in terms of if you want to do something extraordinary with your life, those two things are incompatible.
Well, I totally agree with you. I mean, the passion has got to be greater than the problem, right? So if that's the problem, your passion has to just far outweigh. I mean, that's not even in consideration any longer, right? I mean, I feel extraordinarily blessed because I feel like through God's grace, one way or another, I found a career that I would otherwise do for free. And somehow monetized it. So it never feels like work to me. Like, this doesn't feel like work to me right now. I'm pumped to be here. I'm excited about this conversation. When this is over, I can't wait to get to the next meeting, the next conversation, the next client, to talk about the next issue, because I'm just almost possessed by it. And when I'm done, the end of the day, I'll spend 2 or 3 hours reading peer-reviewed science, or looking at a journal article, or watching a podcast on, one of my mentors, to try to further educate myself. Like, I can't get enough of it. And I think a lot of times that, when people say, I want to be an entrepreneur, I think they really want to be rich. It's not that they really want to be an entrepreneur. Because it took me 45 years to figure that out. I spent, the better part of my life until my early 40s being very inauthentic and really desperately wanting to be wealthy. And I was very good at what I did. I was a mortality expert in the insurance industry, but I was spending my entire time predicting how soon people were going to die, and predicting death to the month, and allowing myself to believe that weren't, that this was just data, and I couldn't have any effect on it, and these were just numbers, and this was just a spreadsheet, and I didn't cause it, and it wasn't my responsibility to get people out of this, or just my responsibility to crunch the data. And really kind of all I cared about at the time was I just so desperately wanted to be wealthy. And I had a major capitulation in my life, when I realized that there were human beings on the other side of these spreadsheets, and that this wasn't just data. And when I left that industry and started focusing on people's well-being and stopped focusing on becoming wealthy, I became wealthy. And now my focus isn't on wealth, it's on well-being. And the wealth just seems to keep coming. And so I think it's an interesting way that the universe works.
So as somebody that has literally switched the direction of your life to help people with their well-being, what is it about some of the most common vices, like drinking or weed smoking or whatever, that have become really just, you get a pass in culture if you do those things, or even some of it, quite frankly, is encouraged? Mm-hmm. What is it about those things that's going to damage somebody's, whether it's mental fitness, as you call it, or just metabolic health? You've talked a lot about oxygen transportation and mitochondria. Like, are the vices that really mess people up, are they things that mess with oxygen transportation? Like, what, or do you think that that's not true and people can drink and stay up late and do recreational drugs? I'm not talking about somebody who's like shooting heroin.
Yeah.
But I'm saying the ones that, like, culturally people are like, yeah, no, there's no big deal. Do you think they are a big deal?
Well, number one, I think they're a big deal. And I think they're a big deal because your purpose isn't big enough, right? Because if the purpose is big enough, then that stuff pales so far in comparison that, like anything that would take me off my game even momentarily. And I think you get a pass in society for it, sure. But if we go really to the root cause of this, or the root drivers of this, like if you said to me, Gary, what is a mood? What is an emotional state? Like, what is it? What's happiness? What's elation, passion, joy, arousal? What is libido? I mean, what actually are they in the human body? Well, they're collections of neurotransmitters, right? Like a recipe. Bound to oxygen, at least the elevated emotional states are. So if you think about, for example, all of the elevated emotional states, passion, elation, joy, arousal, libido, kind of all the hell yeah, I won the lottery emotions. They all have one thing in common. They have oxygen as a part of their molecular structure. All right, this is why nobody has ever woken up laughing. Right? You haven't woken, no human being has ever woken out of a deep sleep laughing. Why? Because you don't have the oxidative state to experience laughter. But can you wake up angry? Sure. I mean, if you want to do a really cool experiment tonight, just pinch your spouse while she's in a deep sleep.
It sounds like a very bad idea, Gary.
Yeah, no, I said you do the experiment, not me. That's why I'm using you as the guinea pig, Tom. And why is it? That's because anger and despair and jealousy and resentment, these are very low, not only are they low frequency emotions, but they're low oxidative emotions, right? So they don't require an elevated oxidative state. And so very often what happens is people have a hard time maintaining elevated emotional states. So they reach elevated emotional states like a heart monitor, right? Not like rolling hills where they can stay in an elevated mood for a prolonged period of time, but they reach it like a heart monitor and they fall. And why is that? It's because their physiology drags them into the state where it most comfortably exists. So now it is harder to push yourself into these emotional states. One of the ways to get there is drugs and alcohol. One of the ways to get there is like promiscuity or like dramatic activity, right? Shocking activity that actually gets you into that emotional state. You try to hold on to it and it falls. And this is why lots of people will spend a lifetime doing the right things, like trying to journal, pray. They develop a morning routine. They try to focus on positive thinking. They go to the right seminars. They try to put themselves in the right rooms. And they can't seem to maintain that elevated emotional state. It's because their physiology is dragging them back down into the state where you most comfortably exist. And so now if we talk about, well, what are some of these recipes like? Well, what is happiness? And this is an exact recipe, but let's say happiness is so much norepinephrine, so much epinephrine, so much dopamine, so much serotonin, boom, you have the emotion happiness. Okay, well, what if you have an issue in the gut? Just methylating one of those neurotransmitters, right? So take serotonin, for example. 90% of the serotonin in our bodies is right here.
So crazy.
If you don't have it here, you can't have it here. So very often, the absence of certain emotional states doesn't begin in the outside environment. Like anxiety rarely begins in your outside environment. It almost always begins with your physiology, and you can prove this. So let's say, for example, that you're having a difficult time methylating serotonin. What does that mean? It means turning an amino acid called tryptophan into the neurotransmitter serotonin. Or dopamine, the main driver of behavior, turning phenylalanine and tyrosine into the neurotransmitter dopamine. Well, you don't have a mood disorder. You don't have a mental illness. You are missing a raw material that's required to assemble certain emotional states. It's just like going to a bakery chef and saying, listen, you could bake whatever you want. You just can't use butter. Okay, well, it doesn't sound like a big deal, right? It's only one ingredient. But if you think of the number of recipes that would affect, cookies, pastries, pies, brownies, what have you, just by removing that one ingredient, it's no different than going to a human being and saying you can be in whatever emotional state you want, you just can't use serotonin. Okay, well, that just wiped out a whole tier of emotion. And that's why, part of my message is about physiology and diet and what we can do to naturally restore proper methylation of neurotransmitters, the creation of these neurotransmitters so they are readily available for us to assemble mood, so we don't have deficits that cause us to seek the types of behaviors that short-term spike those moods.
If you like that clip, check out another powerful clip right here, and I'll see you there.